So thank you for having me. I think it's worth, for the record, I got here by two modes. One was a single occupancy vehicle, was a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. And I regularly travel from my home to my office using a V-Ride van pool, actually, which I coordinate. So I wasn't quite sure whether I should join the raffle. I respectfully declined. So today what I'll be talking about is shared use mobility systems that are emerging today, and then also known impacts of those systems. That's what we really specialize in, is sort of the measurement of those systems. Now, a lot of the data I'll be presenting today is derived from surveys. If you've ever taken one of our surveys and used one of these modes, thank you very much. We put that data to very good use to understand sort of what are the relative impacts of shared use mobility systems that are emerging today, and what will they look like tomorrow. So shared use mobility has been changing how we travel since the start of the 21st century. That's pretty much when things got going for shared use mobility. 1998 was the year in which car sharing was established in the United States, in Portland. And it went back to 1994 when it was established in Montreal. So North America's history of shared use mobility is still relatively recent. There are three forms. The first is car sharing, which I'm sure that you've all heard of. This is a picture of City Car Share, our local car sharing operator. There's also bike sharing, which came on the scene about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, depending on where you start. And this is a picture of a bike sharing station near DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. You check out a bike and you ride it to another station and you check it back in. It's very, very simple. If you're being technical, bike sharing actually has been around longer than car sharing in the form of first and second generation, where you would effectively give somebody your driver's license, or you might just take a bike, a free bike. But in terms of bike sharing as we think of it today in its expansion within the cities, it's the third generation IT-based bike sharing got going about 5 years ago in North America. And then finally we have ride sharing, and this covers a gamut. The big story in ride sharing today right now is with the TNCs, the explosions of the Uber, Lyfts, and sidecars. But there's also, of course, the conventional ride sharing and carpooling and van pooling, which has been around for decades. So these three modes pretty much comprise the sphere of what is shared use mobility. And I'll talk briefly a little bit about each of them. The evolution of car sharing is one that is ongoing rapidly right now. We started with traditional car sharing, and you're familiar with the brands of Zipcar and City Car Share. This is what we call round-trip car sharing. You make a reservation, you take out the car, you go, you travel with it, you come back and you bring it back to the same spot in which you started. And since then, that's been operating for a solid 10 years until along came peer-to-peer car sharing, and then also one-way EV car sharing. So peer-to-peer car sharing is when you take all of those vehicles that you own personally, and you can actually opt them into a network. Traditional car sharing, the network is put there for you, very capital intensive. You have to find a spot for it, but a spot is there, and you can rely on the fact that that vehicle is there. Peer-to-peer car sharing is similar in the sense that the vehicles are already out there and you can use them when people opt into them. You have to find those vehicles. Sometimes you have to meet the owner to get a key. Sometimes it's automated access. But it's a very, very novel idea, and it's gaining a lot of traction and may be a way in which we can scale car sharing into sort of a broader geographic region. And finally, one-way EV car sharing exists now in the US in the form of Car2Go, and also in the emerging form of Drive Now. This is a very interesting experiment undertaken primarily by automakers, I might add. Car2Go is owned by Daimler, and they started in San Diego. Well, they started in Austin, where they put in just basically a one-way system of gasoline-based smart vehicles. And then their first all-EV system is based in San Diego and has been operating for several years there now. It is a zonal-based system, so you can park anywhere on the streets. As long as you can get into the vehicle, if that vehicle has got enough fuel or charge for you to use it, you opt into it, you drive where you need to go, and if you're in the same zone, you'll leave it there. If you don't, then you have to drive it back to the zone. You're being charged while the vehicle is parked outside of the zone. So car sharing over the past 12 years has really gone through somewhat of a significant evolution, evolution, I should say, and it is still ongoing. Now, in terms of the scope of bike sharing really expanded very, very rapidly across North America. It started in Montreal with the Bixby system, and that system, the capital and the sort of technology behind that system, has expanded and is actually the same type of technology that is operating in the Bay Area bike sharing system, and it moved basically from east to west. And in terms of ride sharing, TNCs, there's large impact and there's large potential here. Ride sharing has expanded perhaps the fastest of all three modes. I mean, just 2 years ago, this wasn't really even part of the conversation. And TNC ride sharing really has the potential to challenge part of the dominance of SOVs, but there is also this controversy that exists over their competition with taxis and the regulation of that. And so the evolution of TNCs is something that we have yet to fully see. It's something that is ongoing, and its full impact, it's completely unmeasured as far as we're concerned. Measurements of shared use impact. So shared use transportation is interesting because it increases transportation emissions for some people, and it decreases transportation emissions for other people. We look at this in terms of two types of effects. One is the effect that we can see. We call that the observed impact. And the other is the effect that we also have to think about is the effect that we cannot see. These are impacts that don't happen because the shared use mode is there. Because it's there, I don't do something else that would have been more destructive or more energy intensive. And together they comprise the full impact. Visually it looks like this. Somebody who's before car sharing joins car sharing and they shed that car. And so now they're driving a little bit less. That's what we would call a decrease in annual emissions, and we can see that decrease because we know what they were doing before, we know what they were doing afterwards, we can see it. There's also this other person who joins car sharing and increases their emissions. And they might have been a carless household. They didn't have a car at all. Car's there, they joined, they're driving more. So those are the two types of effects that we have, and it's the balance of those two effects that determine what the impact is in car sharing. There's also the full impact. Now visualize this. You have a person who is carless, joins the car sharing operator, and increases their emissions. So you see an increase in emissions. But if car sharing wasn't there, they would have done something different. They would have bought that vehicle, and they would have driven perhaps more because the marginal cost of using that vehicle would have been lower. And they would have not used transit, not used walking, not used biking and such. And so the full impact is actually a net decrease in emissions, but you have to ask what this hypothetical is in order to understand that. And we focus on that in several of our surveys. This is an example of how that's measured within traditional car sharing. This was a study we did in 2010, and I'll just explain this real quickly. The x-axis is the change in annual emissions that we measured for an individual. And then on the y-axis, we take all the people who are changing, say, 1 metric ton per year of GHG emissions, and we add those people up. And that's that spike you can see on the blue line. That up there is the observed impact, profile of the cumulative observed impact. So we add that up and we see that spike. And all the people to the right of that spike are people who are increasing their emissions, or we measure observed to be increasing their emissions as a result of car sharing. And all the people to the left are those who we measure to be decreasing their emissions as a result of car sharing. And you can see that the massive emissions decrease is larger than that of the increase. What's interesting about this is if you just counted up the people who joined car sharing and asked them, did you increase or decrease your driving? The people who increase their driving would be in the majority. So shared use mobility is something where we have to actually measure, in some cases, to understand sort of what is that overall effect in order to understand really what is the net effect of car sharing. And we can look at the red graph at the bottom and you can see that the mass is even bigger because this accounts for the avoided impacts of car sharing. This accounts for those impacts that are hypothetical, they're not seen, so we have to keep them separate because naturally there's some measurement error there. But we do want to also account for the fact that car sharing is avoiding people actually going out and getting a vehicle and driving it more. And so we find here when we look at this mass, we see that car sharing, its overall, is measured to reduce emissions. Now on the impacts of bike sharing, it's a little bit different. Small operating emissions, point-to-point travel, impacts on driving, and there's impacts on modal shift, driving, public transit, walking, and other modes. And the impacts actually differ based on geography, and we'll look at that in just a moment. This is the impact on driving. It's on an ordinal scale. We ask a very, very simple question. As a result of my use of bike sharing, I drive a personal vehicle, and they can say much more, much less, about the same, I don't do it at all. The whole spectrum of answers is available. And here you can see within the cities on the top are two American cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Salt Lake City, Montreal, Toronto in the middle, and then Mexico City in the bottom. This was sort of just our recently released study. And you can see pretty much everybody reduces their driving as a result of bike sharing in some form. We have a measurement. This doesn't account for exactly how much that is, but in terms of the ordinal shift, the direction of shift, bike sharing is overwhelmingly reducing driving in the city survey. Now, when we look at the impact on rail, we see a different effect. In terms of Minneapolis and St. Paul, we see actually there's a smaller share of people who are actually increasing. More people are increasing their use of rail than decreasing. Whereas in cities like Montreal, Toronto, and even a little bit of Mexico City, people are decreasing their use of rail. And this is a result of city size. So we have in a first-year city survey, Washington, D.C., which also would look a lot like Montreal, Toronto. So it's not a function of being a Canadian city. And so this type of dichotomous impact is important to understand in terms of the type of city and the type of environment in which bike sharing is actually implemented. the geography of the urban environment matters. Why did these people use rail less? Well, because it was because of lower costs and faster travel. In your first 30 minutes you're using a bike sharing vehicle, you can go very far on a bike in 30 minutes, and that's free if you are an annual member. And so in the urban core, which I'll show in a second, that is actually reducing utilization of transit, but it's increasing it on the urban periphery. What are the reasons why people are using bike sharing more because of transit? We asked the people who said they were using it more, why? And the predominant answer was I had better access to both to and from the rail line. In terms of the impact of walking, we also see this kind of split. More people in Minneapolis and St. Paul are walking more often than less often, but there's a lot of people who are walking less often. And the shift away from walking in the cosmopolitan Canadian cities, it's a function of the city, not of Canada, is a little bit broader, so it matches that of transit. And in Mexico City, people are walking more often. And this is just last two geographic slides I'll present. This is look, we have a location of the people we know where people are. So we ask them, what's a cross street where you live? And we geocode that. And then we map that to what their modal shift is. So in these circles, you can see where are our survey respondents. There's the numbers. And then you can see in the red, those are people who moved away from rail, decreasing rail. And you can see that they're highly concentrated in the middle. And then on the periphery of the city, you can see the green areas are in larger shares, and that's where people are increasing rail at a higher percentage. So what this shows is that the geography of the city matters. Even in cities where we observe large shifts away from rail, we're actually seeing that in the sort of lower density environments, bike sharing is providing more of an access to and from the rail line. And then this, lastly, is just that shift in Minneapolis, which is much more universal. And one thing you can notice about Minneapolis is that it's a city with pretty much one or two lines. I mean, it's got the Hiawatha, it's not called the Blue Line, but it was back then called the Hiawatha Line and then the North Star Line, and it's one line. So in areas where bike sharing can facilitate access and egress to that line and doesn't necessarily cross-cut, well-established networks of cities, of transit lines, bike sharing is going to add to transit, whereas if it's going to provide a shortcut or a faster form of mobility, it's going to probably take ridership off of the lines, but that's where rail is most congested anyway. So just to wrap up, shared use mobility is evolving rapidly and has been shown in the way we've measured it to have profound impacts on travel. Traditional car sharing and bike sharing reduce emissions and reduce the need for personal vehicles. And as shared use mobility evolves and expands into new regions, we're likely to see that this dynamic is going to change, and it's also going to magnify. So thank you very much.